GameSmith Foundation series. In this episode, we're going to be talking about basic mixtures. And by basic mixtures, I mean how are we mixing our glue, our paint, our flocking, and our aggregate together. After all, we throw around a lot of terms here at the GameSmith, like using a 50-50 mixed or using a 3-stone aggregate. And this Foundations video is going to explain what those are and how to make them. To begin with, I want to talk about flocking. Now, most tabletop crafters will use turf and flock as synonymous things, even though they're technically not. Turf is any material that you cover a play surface with that could look like snow, it could look like the dirt, it could look like grass, whatever it is you want. Whereas flock is typically a fibrous material that is made to stand up vertically, like static grass, that can look like wheat or weeds or something like that. But since most tabletop crafters use turf and flocking as synonymous terms with one another, we're going to do that too. Now, there are a lot of great companies out there that make excellent flock and turf, but I'm going to show you how to make your own basic mixture for just a few dollars. To build our own turf and flocking, I went to the local bulk food store and purchased some rosemary, parsley, rubbed sage, and Italian sage or spice. I don't know why I labeled this sage. This is Italian spice. Each of these herbs has its own color, texture, and size. I spent a grand total of about $3 on what I have here. We want to pour our different herbs into a sealable container. At this point, I'm not really concerned about the proportions of the mixture. However, if that's a concern for you, I'd start with about a quarter cup of each of your herbs. You're going to want to experiment with the proportions in order to produce the colors and textures you want. Take this rosemary, for example. It's shaped in these long strands that kind of look like tree branches. You may want to break them up in order to make the debris smaller, or remove it from your mixture entirely. An easy method to break the rosemary is to crush it while it's still in the bag. Once you have the mixture in the proportions you want, you need only shake up the container to thoroughly mix it all together. The result is this colorful and textured flock. As mentioned, we can always change the proportions in order to change the color of the mixture. We could also add other herbs such as red peppercorns in order to add red to the mixture. You're really only limited by the herbs that are available to you. Now, if we wanted to create a more powdery or turf-like consistency, we could simply grind up our mixture into tiny fragments. We need only crush the herbs until we get the texture we want. And of course, while we do this, the smell is awesome. Now, of course, you can alter this recipe to suit whatever your needs are depending on the build that you're working on. You might want to add more parsley to look more like fallen leaves, or more rosemary in order to appear like fallen sticks off of a tree. You might add more rubbed sage in order to create more of a bushy appearance. It's entirely up to you and depends on the needs of your build. Now, the next basic mixture that I want to share with you is our rocky aggregate. An aggregate is just a collection of different sized particles that are all mixed together. Now, you can actually go out and buy some aggregate in the form of construction sand that has small, medium, and large particles already mixed together. Now, I like to go to the dollar store and get different sized decorative rocks and mix those together. And I'm going to share with you how I do that next. Our aggregate begins with decorative sand from the dollar store. I chose blue so it would be really easy to see. And this is a very coarse sand, which I like better than the fine sand. With the coarse sand, you can actually see the granules quite easily. The fine sand particles are a lot harder to see and wouldn't really show any texture in the mixture. Our medium-sized aggregate is this glitter gravel from the dollar store. The glitter gravel in of itself is not needed. I just like the shapes and the sizes of the gravel. These particles are oddly shaped and jagged, and they have a more rock-like appearance to them. The final component of our aggregate are these decorative pebbles, which also come from the dollar store. These pebbles are much larger than the others and are also irregular shaped, and they have a more natural feel to them. Now we can mix our basic aggregate. I suggest starting with a quarter cup of the largest pebbles. Next, a quarter cup of the glitter gravel. Finally, we'll switch to a half cup and add our coarse sand to the mixture. Now we put the lid on our container and mix up our different sized rocks. The result is our 3-stone aggregate, which is ready for our next project. Now, when it comes to our homemade aggregate, we can change the proportions to suit the needs of our projects. You can add or subtract or even add more sizes of decorative stones to the mixture. As I mentioned, you need not worry about the colors because you'll likely end up gluing the aggregate in place and then painting it with a PVA or a Mod Podge mixture. Now our final basic mixture is our ever-present 50-50 mix, which I think over the course of about 50 videos I've mentioned at least 100 times. Now what I'm referring to is a whole volume of liquid that has been divided in half with 50% water and 50% glue or Mod Podge or paint or some other liquid in order to create the whole. Now, as we move that ratio around, we're actually changing the properties of the liquids that we're mixing together. And that actually has an impact on how we use them and their functionality on the crafts that we're building. And I want to share that information with you next. The basis of most of the 50-50 mixtures I use start with simple PVA glue. Now, PVA glue is simply polyvinyl acetate and has been around for about 100 years. All of these brands I found at the dollar store and the craft store. The glue works very well to bond surfaces together, and it generally flows very well. And most importantly, it's very easy to dilute. To illustrate what I mean, I'm going to perform a little experiment. We'll add a dollop of this Jot brand, Ross brand, and Elmer's brand glue to this cardboard sheet. I'll tilt the sheet upward to a vertical position, and we can watch how the different brands flow downwards. We can see that they're all moving at relatively the same pace, and they're all relatively the same thickness. So for the purposes of what we're using the PVA glue, there isn't really much of a difference between these three brands, except for maybe the price. Next I want to mix some water and PVA glue in equal proportions, hence why I call it the 50-50 mixture. It's very important to thoroughly mix the two liquids so that there's no clumps of glue. Now obviously if I was going to be crafting with this, I would mix a much larger batch. I'm only using such small proportions to illustrate how these mixtures work. Now that our 50-50 mixture is completely blended, we repeat our drip test. I'll just pour a bit onto this cardboard, and we tip it upwards. The 50-50 mixture flows much more quickly, and you can see at the top that the glue thins out. When I turn the cardboard on its side, you can see the glue accumulate at the edge, but it doesn't flow. We actually need to break the surface tension of the glue so that it will flow in the new direction. Likewise, if I change the flow direction again, the glue stays in place until I break the surface tension again. This feature will be very helpful while crafting, so that the glue will actually stay where I put it, and it won't spread all over the build. Next, if we add another spoonful of water to the mix, we create a 66-33 mixture. But for simplicity's sake, we'll call it a 70-30 mix. After we thoroughly mix the glue again, we can put a small dollop on some cardboard and tilt it upwards. The mixture flows much quicker. And when I change the direction of the board, the mixture changes direction too. To quickly summarize, when you mix water and PVA, you're going to change how it behaves. Now, depending on the materials you're working with, you might want the PVA to be thick or thin. You may want it to flow more easily down into the nooks and crannies of a build, or you want it to stay in one place. I recommend not increasing the ratio higher than 70% water, or you'll effectively negate the adhesive properties of the glue. I also suggest that you keep some pre-mixed glue available, and make sure that you clearly label your mixtures in order to avoid any mishaps. Now, while we're talking about glue, we should definitely talk about Mod Podge. Mod Podge is probably the single most useful product that I've been using throughout my crafting. Now, I really like PVA glue, but there are some very important differences between Mod Podge and PVA. The Mod Podge also has a medium in it, which allows you to add paint to it, and it doesn't actually thin out the color of the paint. So throughout my videos, you can always see that I'm making a 50-50 mixture of paint and Mod Podge, because I really want the glue in order to hold my builds together, but I also want the color to remain unchanged, and that's what the medium in the Mod Podge does. And the other big feature that Mod Podge has that PVA doesn't have is that it acts as a sealer. So on decoupage, for example, you are layering multiple pieces of paper together in order to create a pattern, and when you cover it in Mod Podge, it seals those layers together. Not only does it glue them together, but it seals them together as well. And when we're working on our tabletop crafts and our tabletop terrain, this is a very helpful feature with this material. So Mod Podge is extremely versatile, and it's absolutely worth the little extra money that you have to pay for it. We hope that you found this episode of the GameSmith Foundation series enjoyable and informative. If you like what we're doing here at the GameSmith, please hit that like and subscribe button. Check us out at our website at thegamesmith.org. Check us out on Facebook or Pinterest or on Instagram. And until next time, I'll see you at the table.